I just started the recording, so it will be recorded.
Very good. Good work. Somebody's thinking. All right, well, let's go ahead and get started so we just get the recording out to people. Thank you, Emily, for being here so it feels less stilted. My performance will be less wooden, hopefully. Share my screen. All right. Welcome, everybody, all of you. Settle down, everyone. Don't make me put your head on your desks. Welcome to Horseshoe Crab Volunteer Training, Take 2. All right. One of the things we wanted to do this year is talk about some of the newer issues that everybody's talking about in the horseshoe crab conservation world. Big one around here is the giant pharmaceutical conglomerate Charles River Labs, the biggest company in the world when it comes to bleeding horseshoe crabs to make the test for bacterial contamination of drugs and other medical equipment, is moving to Harwich. Potentially putting a lot more pressure on Cape Cod horseshoe crab populations. So it's a big thing that everybody's talking about. RFC, this has been an issue for a while. This is a possible synthetic replacement for the test based on horseshoe crab blood, the LAL test. Talk about the state trawl data, how we've been hitting quota lately. Just some of the basics as a review. It's always helpful. Horseshoe crabs are a benthic marine arthropod, if you want to sound really scientific. I volunteer with benthic marine arthropods. They are not really crabs. They are more closely related to ticks and spiders. Distributed from Maine to the Yucatan Peninsula, they reach their highest densities in kind of the mid-Atlantic states and the southeastern states. 450 million years old is a common estimate for how long these guys have been around, relatively unchanged. I mean, try to get your head around that. Good Lord. Despite being very, very well studied, there are a lot of mysteries still about horseshoe crabs. We think they live up to 20 years, mature at 8 to 10. We're not so sure region by region how that varies. It's very difficult to age them. People have tried to age them by looking at how many barnacles and slipper shells and so forth are on them, but it doesn't tend to work very well. They spawn on beaches in spring, and that's why we're all here. There are also Asian species of horseshoe crab that are in different genera, 2 different genera. Limulus polyphemus is ours, and then they have these Tachypleus crabs that are actually also bled to create the same kind of test. And Charles River Labs has operations in Asia that they also make TAL. They are a $16 billion company. They are sexually dimorphic species, and if you've been out in the field, you've seen that the males have the boxing glove appendages at the front, and once they become mature, immature males, like males that have not molted for the mostly final time, males that are not ready to spawn yet, don't have the boxing gloves, the pedipalps they're called. If you are seeing those, that is a mature male who's ready to spawn. Females just have pinchies is the scientific term, all the way up to the front pair of legs. They have, let's see, their mouth is here at the base of the legs, oddly, and they have all those kind of spines in there, I think, to help crush things up. They're eating things like small shellfish and worms, I think, for the most part. And which is why they were historically persecuted up until fairly recently as a predator of clams. So we'll get into that a little bit later. They have book gills. These sort of flaps here are their gills, where they get oxygen from the water. They can survive between the tides by just burrowing in kind of the intertidal sediment, and keeping those book gills moist is all they need to do. If they get flipped, the way they used to kill them, it used to be a condition of the shellfish permits that you had to kill any horseshoe crabs you saw by breaking the tail and then throwing it up above the high tide line, so it couldn't right itself, and then the book gills would dry out. They have compound eyes. They have various simple eyes too that are light receptors. This is called the prosoma. And when we measure them, we get the width of the prosoma from here to here. We do that when we tag them. The state keeps track of that data as well. Track the size of the crabs over time and if they're changing. Here's a mated pair. If you've been out there, you've hopefully seen this by now. Females are bigger and often darker and often completely hidden. If you see just a male sitting still on the surface, there's almost certainly a female buried underneath him if you just kind of poke your finger down a little bit. Molt. Unlike true crabs, which walk out the back of their shells when they molt, these guys walk out the front of their shells. It splits right at the front, and this is how you can tell a molt. A molt will be sort of smaller, paler, and brittle compared to like an old dead crab, and it will have this split at the front. People sometimes see the molts on beaches, particularly Nantucket Sound, which is downstream of Monomoy, where there are tons of tons of crabs, particularly juveniles, and people see these molts washed up. And in the past, they've thought there was a die-off, but there's an easy way to tell that it was actually good news. There's the molts from a lot of juvenile crabs that are out there. Their life cycle, May and June. It was thought that it was based on the moons, but it's not really based on the moon so much around here. They spawn more when it's calm and warm. It doesn't really matter how high the tide is, at least places we work. In some parts of the state, some parts of the Cape, there are places where where they spawn more at night. But it has not been the case as far as we can tell here in Wellfleet Harbor. They lay these little green eggs. You would not see them at the surface. They're actually very hard to find here on the Cape because we have such a low density of crabs most of the places we work. But down in Delaware Bay, you can actually, the little green eggs are at the surface because they're digging up each other's nests. There are so many of them. And then these are then available to birds like the red knot. I think we realized last time that I somehow didn't have a picture of a red knot and didn't get into that. Hopefully we will this time. And then they hatch into these adorable little trilobite larvae that look a lot like an adult. And they're sort of planktonic until they settle out somewhere, hopefully in some appropriate creek or mud flat, some good kind of low energy nursery habitat with lots of food. And then they grow and molt, grow and molt, grow and molt. Oops. Molt and grow. That's their job. And sometimes you can see them scooting around the surface. A lot of times the best indication that there are juveniles around are these tracks that sort of look like a moon shell, a moon snail track. And then eventually after 10 or 12 years, they'll, depending on who you ask, they either do a terminal molt or they continue to molt occasionally as adults, depending on what publication you look in. And then they recruit into the breeding population. Females will spawn multiple times per year. They have 80, I think on the Cape, not as many eggs as further south, but 80,000 eggs or something like that. And they deposit them in batches. And apparently they don't lay all of them in a season. They'll be done for the season still with a bunch of eggs inside their body. But they will spawn multiple times over the course of a spring. And then, then the males, it's often asked, when you have 7 males around a female, what's the point of those other males? Satellite males, as they're called, the ones that are not the primary guy who's like attached. If you've tried to ever detach them, like during tagging or something like that, you know that he is really hanging on for dear life there. But the other males can contribute sperm. She digs down, lays eggs, and then it's up to this guy to just sort of inject his sperm into the general area and fertilize the eggs. Satellite males can also get in on the action, and they've shown that they are able to fertilize some percentage of the eggs as well. So there is something to be battled for, even if you're not the primary male. Here we go. Somehow I chose a photo with no red knots in it. These are all semi-palmated sandpiper, which is also a declining Arctic nesting shorebird that conservationists are very concerned about. And so it's not just red knots that are eating the horseshoe crab eggs down in Delaware Bay, but this is a big deal in horseshoe crab management coastwide, particularly in the states around Delaware Bay. Providing food for shorebirds is of paramount importance in how they manage the horseshoe crab fishery down there. And so, I'm sorry, I don't have a red knot photo, but this is what it looks like down there. Tons of crabs. They're digging up each other's nests. There are eggs available at the surface. The red knot, which is now a federally threatened, there's a federally threatened subspecies of red knot. It's a beautiful, medium-sized, high Arctic nesting shorebird that in their spring migration, they go from Patagonia, marshes at the basically the southern tip of South America, at the other end of the continent. They make their way up to Delaware Bay. They hope to find lots of horseshoe crab eggs. They need to get up to a certain threshold body weight. And so there have to be a certain amount of eggs available to them as they compete with the other birds. And then they fly straight back to the Arctic once they get up to a certain body weight. And then they have the month of June basically to breed, and that's it. And so they're impacted by climate change, the more extreme warming that's happening up in the Arctic. They have more warming than we do, and so they're having to deal with that. They're having to deal with issues down in Delaware Bay, where they've actually had some cold years, including this year, where the horseshoe crabs don't come in at the right time. So right now in Delaware Bay, the water's colder than it should be, and the horseshoe crabs aren't mating in the numbers they should be. When the birds are there, kind of looking around, you wouldn't think that. The waters up here, Gulf of Maine, are warming so much, you wouldn't think you'd have these cold water episodes, but it's just how things are. There's a lot of annual variation in the way the world works, and often climate change is behind some of the counterintuitive ones. So there are a lot of issues that red knots have to deal with. So they manage the horseshoe crab fishery down there to provide enough eggs for red knots and other shorebirds. New Jersey eliminated bait harvest of horseshoe crabs altogether. I don't know, 20 years ago. I'm trying to remember exactly when it was. And then in the other states, a little more recently, they went to a male only harvest. So you cannot harvest female horseshoe crabs in Delaware and Maryland. Maryland has additional protections where you can't do what we do here, what people do on the Cape here, where they hand harvest them while they're trying to spawn on the beaches. That's allowed in Massachusetts. In Maryland, they're protected until something like mid-June. I can't remember. Bailey's been putting together all of the different state regulations. But basically, the take-home message is there are more protections in other states. And I'm going to get to some other slides later on and realize I talked about all the regulation stuff already, but it happens. So we talked about how they're considered predators of mollusks. They are. I mean, they're eating just benthic invertebrates that they come along as they cruise along the bottom. And that includes all kinds of worms and, gemma clams and, juvenile quahogs and juvenile softshell clams if they come across those. But I think it was generally way overestimated how detrimental they were, if at all, to clam populations. And so they were sort of persecuted for no good reason, I think, back then. Food source. So this has come up before. Sharks, I don't think they're not adult horseshoe crabs are not a significant food source for anything really, but things like loggerhead sea turtles further south have been documented feeding on them. And for any individual turtle, it could be a significant food source if they come across a lot of them. Sharks have been documented to eat them, but it's more about their eggs, and larvae and juveniles tend to feed more things than the adults do. And they
Mark,
yeah.
sorry to bother you. Is there anyone in the waiting room? We have two people that said that they aren't able to get in.
Well, you would be able to see that. I can't see
Okay.
that stuff.
All right. I just wanted to make sure. Thank you.
So they stir up the sediment on the bottom and suspend nutrients into the water column. I think is a role they've had historically. That sounds like somebody's checking in finally. We often call it rototilling the bottom. So a lot of you have probably seen these photos. So they were in the past, they were harvested en masse to just be ground up for cattle feed and fertilizer. I mean, things have been worse, a lot worse in the past in terms of how horseshoe crabs were exploited as a resource. Currently, they're harvested. The fishery now is harvesting horseshoe crabs to be chopped up as bait in the whelk fishery, which is apparently a $3.8 million fishery in Massachusetts. It's the fishery no one's ever heard of. It's just they catch these big whelks, these big snails, basically that are like conch. If you've had conch in the Caribbean, they export it to other countries. Scungili in an Italian restaurant, kind of an obscure thing, is whelk. And it's a trap fishery like lobster traps, and they use horseshoe crabs as bait. As the price has gone up, they use less and less of a horseshoe crab, 1/16 or something like that, as bait. Lots of work has been done trying to figure out alternative baits like green crabs and things, and apparently, according to the fishers, nothing else works like horseshoe crabs. I've never heard of them being used as lobster bait. I can't imagine that's a thing. I'm sure it has been in the past. So but the biomedical use, Limulus amebicite lysate, is the assay produced from an enzymatic cascade that constitutes the horseshoe crab's immune system. Basically, this enzymatic cascade responds to the presence of endotoxin, which is something that is produced by gram-negative bacteria that tend to cause fevers and illness. And so they took this immune system and turned it into a pretty nifty little test for bacterial contamination of drugs and medical equipment. Much has been made of the connection between horseshoe crabs, LAL, and the COVID vaccines. But vaccines are not, individual doses of vaccine are not tested with LAL. And I think there's been a lot of misinformation in the press. Batches of components, big batches of components get tested, get the seal of approval, and then those batches are made into individual doses. The dose of vaccine that you got probably did have endotoxin in it, according to industry insiders that I've talked to. It's really just big batches of things like the purified water gets tested. Some of the other components get tested in, big vats and whatever, and then made into the individual vaccine doses. So I think people think you need more LAL than you really do when it comes to rolling out a new vaccine. We already talked about the fertilizer and livestock feed. That was 1850s through the 1970s. Talked about a lot of this stuff. Bait harvest began in the 90s, and it peaked back in the late 90s and has declined since then. It was sort of an very unsustainable level of harvest back then. And then biomedical reporting didn't start until 2004. And it's still difficult. We can't really get numbers from the biomedical harvest because there are few enough fishers participating in that fishery that they can't reveal numbers under an obscure law in fisheries management, where the data is confidential unless there are above a certain number of people participating in the fishery. So that's been frustrating. So they've been subject to overfishing, bleeding mortality. The bleeding mortality, when they bleed them and return them to the embayment, they're supposed to return them to the embayment they got them from. Around here, that's mostly Pleasant Bay. And the bleeding mortality is like 15 to 30%, 15 or 20%, I think, is a pretty good mid-range if you look at the different studies. So 1 out of every 5 crabs, and they tend to target the females, doesn't survive the bleeding. They produce lots and lots and lots and lots of eggs and lots and lots and lots of babies, and then some very small percentage of them survive. That's K-selected life history if you're into wildlife population dynamics terminology. They seem to have pretty limited dispersal, but it depends on where you look. In Pleasant Bay, those crab studies have shown pretty much live in Pleasant Bay their whole lives. As the inlets have changed, we're seeing some tagged crabs. We saw a tagged crab come into Pleasant Bay from Monomoy. That wasn't possible 10 years ago. Robins are growing crazy. I think they're attacking a hawk in my yard. And so that's been interesting, but previous studies have shown that for the most part, the Pleasant Bay population is pretty self-contained. In Chatham, they will move around between Monomoy and Nantucket Sound, meaning from a protected area to an unprotected area where they can be harvested. And studies by Mike Long, grad student we worked with in Wellfleet, shows that they move between Wellfleet Harbor, Wellfleet Bay, and Cape Cod Bay. And so they will finish spawning at a certain point and then leave, head back out into Cape Cod Bay. It's not clear where, but their dispersal it varies by embayment. Habitat loss is a big thing. We'll talk about that more. That's something that you need to consider as you're managing this species. They've suffered a lot of loss of spawning habitat because of erosion, rock walls, sea level rise, all of those things, dredging projects, beach nourishment. Some folks saw this at one of the survey sites right next to the mouth of Barnstable Harbor is a site that our Long Pasture Sanctuary surveys, and it's called Millway. And they were adding sand this week to the base of the dune, and they ran over crabs with the heavy equipment. The volunteers got photos of that, and then the sand is potentially covering up, nests as it moves around. And I think that was kind of a no-no that we're looking into. But all of these kinds of things happening at the coast, they can negatively impact these guys. So, they don't have the habitat they used to for spawning and for juveniles, nursery habitat, and so we need to manage them with that in mind. And certainly water quality, too much nitrogen, the loss of eelgrass, low oxygen, the different things that come with the water quality issues that we have here on the Cape, mostly because of nitrogen pollution, certainly impact their feeding habitat, and thus their, I think, long-term survival, and leads to decreased prey availability. So here's a spawning beach in Delaware Bay. Almost looks like Marsh 2-3 here. Here's a spawning beach on Monomoy. Down there, kind of the northwest side of Monomoy is where you see spawning like this. So here's, New Jersey, no bait harvest. Monomoy here in Massachusetts, no bait harvest, no biomedical harvest allowed on Monomoy. Lots of good habitat, good spawning habitat, good juvenile habitat on Monomoy. So this is our check on what the Cape used to look like in terms of spawning horseshoe crabs. And I want to be careful that we're not just falling into the shifting baseline problem where, in all fisheries, like nobody's alive still that remembers when cod used to be 4 feet long and super abundant. And now we just sort of accept this new low density of cod and we continue to fish. And, we're sort of in that situation with horseshoe crabs where we get excited when we see 30 horseshoe crabs on the sanctuary beach, when in reality it looked like this at one time. And I think that's really important to keep in mind. Pleasant, this is, it can look even crazier than this. This is Marsh 2-3, which is in Pleasant Bay. And Nauset Marsh, our one site there is the backside of Nauset Spit called it's to north of Priscilla's Landing in Orleans. It can look like this. And neither of those embayments are subject to bait harvest. So no bait harvest, no bait harvest, no bait harvest. Here's Wellfleet. We get more than this sometimes, but relatively few. A fraction of what we see in these other embayments where you have good habitat and no bait harvest. And so it's important that we continue to do these spawning surveys in these different embayments with different management regimes, to kind of track how things change. The Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission manages a lot of different fisheries at the kind of regional coast-wide level, the Atlantic coast-wide management. And so they set quotas for each state, but then states can make their own quotas that are more restrictive, but not less restrictive. So Massachusetts quota, the state imposed quota is much lower than the useless ASMFC quota that I have no idea what it's based on. ASMFC is fairly useless when it comes to helping us manage our horseshoe crabs better in Massachusetts for a lot of reasons. Down south, they're very focused on the big populations down south, New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland. They're using adaptive management, taking red knots into account, as I talked about earlier, making sure there are enough crabs to feed the red knots. Male only harvest. New Jersey, no harvest at all. Redundant bullet point I need to get rid of. Make a note. They do stock assessments periodically that everybody looks at. And in 2013, they were sort of seeing the writing on the wall. New York and New England continue to see a decrease in abundance, worse than it was in 2009. And mainly they're looking at state trawl data. The unfortunate thing, the ASMFC doesn't accept any of the spawning survey data that we collect or that anyone else collects in other states. It's not just us. No, not just picking on Massachusetts. They don't like spawning survey data collected by volunteers because it tends to be sporadic and the time series are blink on and off. They're not very long. So they use these state trawl surveys down in Delaware Bay, and then up here, Massachusetts Division of Marine Fisheries does these trawl surveys in spring and fall for groundfish, where they get a certain number of horseshoe crabs as bycatch, very, very few. But that data set goes back to the 70s, and so it's a nice long time series where they do it the same every year, and so that's what they use. The more recent stock assessment, I wrote them a letter telling them that the state trawl data was useless. The science committee for the ASMFC, when they were doing the 2019 stock assessment. And I guess they sort of came to that conclusion on their own. They did not include the Cape Cod Bay trawl survey data from DMF. But as a result, we got this sort of weird grade here in the Northeast where it was just all they included was the Nantucket Sound trawl data from the Division of Marine Fisheries and then some Rhode Island data. And they gave us this neutral stock assessment because the crabs tend to be doing pretty well in Nantucket Sound. So it was not a very useful stock assessment. Very little data was actually included. Here in Massachusetts, a hand harvester, they're allowed, it's a legal fishery. You're allowed to harvest horseshoe crabs for bait if you have a permit. During spawning season, you can go out on a day when the crabs are trying to spawn and you can take 400 of them and then take them back to the bait dealer to be chopped up and used as bait. It's pretty controversial. We're starting to look at that more and more as other states tighten up their regulations. You know, there was one of the fishermen years back was like, I can't believe you let us harvest them while they're spawning. But this is what they can do. And so there's somebody who harvests right off the sanctuary beach at Wellfleet Bay Sanctuary. And so you'll see them there in between the survey windows. So that they're prohibited from harvesting during the same 5-day windows when we do our spawning surveys, the lunar windows. But in between those surveys, you get some nice weather, a lot of crab spawning, and they're out there and taking 400 a day. There's been increasing trawl harvest. That's kind of complicated. It has to do with the fluke fishery south of the Cape. And so they went down to 300 a day, but overall the harvest has increased and we're now hitting quota every year. We never used to get near the bait quota of 165,000 and now we hit it every year in recent years. And that's should continue for the foreseeable future. I didn't talk about, let's see. One thing I didn't talk about was I talked about the biomedical fishery. There's a targeted biomedical fishery. That's the only harvest that's allowed in Pleasant Bay is biomedical, where they're bled at the facility in Falmouth, Associates of Cape Cod, and then released back into within at least 36 hours. They have to be back in some kind of water, but they use holding pens, some controversial practices with that kind of harvest as well. But the biomedical bleeders depend on bait crabs as well through a program called the Rent-A-Crab program, where they get crabs that were harvested for bait, they bleed them at their facility, and then return them to the bait dealer, presumably to be used as bait. It's called the Rent-A-Crab program. And so the bait regulations are largely, when the state is thinking about the bait harvest, they are thinking about the supply for the biomedical companies, not just the bait dealers. And so the biomedical harvest is very relevant to all of the regulations in Massachusetts, both bait and biomedical. And so that's one reason we're concerned about Charles River Labs locating here. Will the state want to increase bait harvest in order to keep up supply for those guys? Is something I'm personally concerned about. Massachusetts commercial bait landings. So, you know, the red dotted line is the quota. We never used to hit that, but now we do. We went over it in 2019 because they're not like, they don't have up to the second data. It's pretty common in fisheries that you go over the quota because people haven't reported their catches yet. And we're going to be right around or over quota, I think, from here on out, the way things are working with the fluke fishery and the bycatch. So here are the bait closures, bait fishery closures in Massachusetts. You have Pleasant Bay is biomedical only. Monomoy is no harvest of any kind, Monomoy National Wildlife Refuge, and these disputed waters to the west that Chatham claims it is not federal. And then anything within the bounds of the Cape Cod National Seashore, there's no bait harvest allowed. So all the federal ownership, there's no bait harvest, with the exception of, I can't even, it's so hard to explain Pleasant Bay. This is technically part of the Cape Cod National Seashore, but biomedical harvest is allowed. I'm not exactly sure how that worked out, but and then in Cape Cod Bay, bait harvest is allowed. Nantucket Sound, bait harvest is allowed. The bay only accounts for something like 8 to 12% of the bait harvest in any given year. Most of it comes out of Nantucket Sound. Most of it is from trawlers. There's a seminal study that MJ James Peary from the University of Rhode Island, working with Kathy Tuxbury, who was working for Bob here at Wellfleet Bay back in the late 90s into the early 2000s. And they did this big study looking at spawning densities, egg densities, size, structure, and movement patterns by using tagging mark recapture of horseshoe crabs out here in Pleasant Bay, Nauset, and then Cape Cod Bay, Wellfleet Bay. They found very low densities, as we see, compared to other states. They didn't include Monomoy, which has always had higher densities than other places. Tagging, they tended to stay in the embayments. But like I said, other studies have showed some movement between, more recent studies have shown movement between embayments. Egg core is very low densities of eggs within the nests. So there've been lots of different studies here on the Cape. A lot of research on horseshoe crabs here on Cape Cod. In terms of spawning surveys, the reason we're all here, what you help us with, there are a lot of different organizations doing these in the northeastern U.S. and here in Massachusetts. You know, we work with DMF, but there are even organizations who are not on here who started doing them recently, like the Southeastern Mass Pine Barrens Alliance. They've been hosting some interesting talks. They survey Plymouth Beach for the last few years. All right, so I think it's Bailey's turn to talk about the protocols.
Thank you, Mark. Emily, did you have a question? I saw you raised the hand earlier.
Just, I can wait till the end. I was just curious, the biomedical harvesting, is that only allowed in Pleasant Bay, or is that in other areas too?
I'm not sure where Mark went,
Oh.
but can you repeat that question one more time?
So on that map he showed, it showed that there was where bait harvest was allowed and not allowed, but he said biomedical harvest was allowed in Pleasant Bay. I didn't know if that's the only area on the Cape that they were doing biomedical harvesting, or if it was allowed in other areas.
I think it is only And Mark, I think you could touch on this. I think it is only Pleasant Bay that does the biomedical harvesting.
Yeah, sorry, I signed out accidentally briefly. The question was, yeah. So that's what I was talking about. The Pleasant Bay is biomedical only harvest. I actually didn't hear the question.
I just wasn't sure if that was the only place on the Cape that biomedical harvest was allowed, and then those other areas you mentioned that
No,
were bait
yeah,
harvest and not allowed. And
it's a good question, and I'm not sure I fully understood. If you have a permit to harvest horseshoe crabs for biomedical purposes, you can harvest anywhere in Massachusetts. But in practice, it tends to be Pleasant Bay is where there is a biomedical focused harvest.
Okay.
Other places like crabs that are harvested in Eastham and Wellfleet, if they get bled, it's from a bait dealer. It's
I see.
from the rent-a-crab
That
program. It's
rent.
not,
Okay.
there's really not a targeted biomedical fishery in Cape Cod Bay. If anybody confronts one of the bait fishermen, they don't want to have that conversation about what they're doing. So what they always say is we're doing medical research or something like that. But they're not. They're bait harvesting.
Thank you.
Sure.
And Kathy? I think you're still muted.
Okay. Last year when we were doing the survey, one of my friends and I who were doing it, we happened upon what we think was illegal harvesting. Because it was during, it was during the window that we're supposed to be doing the survey. What is one supposed to do in that circumstance?
Tell us. And we should probably, hasn't really come up. I mean, that's like, we're always asking people to be vigilant about that, but that's a big deal. Where was this?
I believe it was at the sanctuary.
And it was during the 5-day, it was during the spawning survey window.
Yeah, we were out on a survey.
And you saw the guy, I mean, it's usually like, it's a whaler. He's got a long handled clam rake and he's just putting them into a boat. It's not ambiguous.
It didn't appear ambiguous, though. They appeared to be on the shore, picking them up and putting them in buckets.
Mm.
And then and then there was a boat, like a little Boston whaler trawler style, kind of right off, and they were in waders. So I thought, because I was kind of dumb, and this was literally my first survey, we thought that they were another survey team. We're like, oh, but then wait a minute, they're in a boat. And so the person who was sort of the senior survey person on our team, they're like, well, I think she said she was going to report it to somebody, but it was like, well, wait a minute. Like, she said, yeah, no, like, let's not mix in with these guys. But they weren't, they had to have been, they were picking up horseshoe crabs and putting them in buckets. So
yeah, that's a huge deal. And I never heard about it. And it's unfortunate. We've not heard, typically they're not poaching blatantly, especially they know we're watching them, and they wouldn't typically do that right off of the sanctuary. So it's all a bit puzzling. So you take pictures, you take videos, you get boat number, you do all the logical things. And that's why we have these trainings so people understand the regulations and understand that you can't be harvesting crabs for bait. They're not going to tell you, they're not going to be honest about what they're doing. That's, like I said, biomedical research or whatever. And so, yeah, get that information, get photos, and then tell us right away. And it's an environmental police, and we should probably give you guys the number for the environmental police. Just so it's as quick as possible.
That it's legal for them to be doing that during our survey window?
No.
That would be good to know. Thank you. Sorry for interrupting.
Yeah, no, that was an important. When was that? Last year?
Yeah.
Okay. Who was the lead? Do you know? The lead surveyor?
I don't remember. It was just, we were just all volunteers, and it was a woman that had just been a volunteer before. So
yeah. We try to make sure there's experience.
It wasn't like a lead. It wasn't like a Bailey. It was just like just,
Yeah. Relatively experienced. Yeah, that's how it works.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right.
unusual. Yeah, we get typically when we get reports, it's people who don't know that there's a legal fishery. They don't think there should be. They're like, someone's harvesting horseshoe crabs, and it's like, well, yeah, they're allowed to. It's outside of the window, but this is a very unusual report, and so yeah, we get that documented if we ever see that again. So thank you. All right, are we ready for Bailey to talk protocols?
All right, I am going to share my screen. Let's see. Are you all able to see the PowerPoint? Yes, no?
Yep, we're good. I
Okay,
can see it.
great. All right.
Yes.
Okay. So as we go into the spawning survey protocols, the majority of the information is the same as previous years, but for those of you who are new or are not aware of the protocols, there are certain supplies that you're going to be using for every single survey. You're going to get a 5x5 meter quadrat pole. This is going to be measuring the amount of space where you're counting the crabs at one single time. And I'll go into that a little bit more, showing you what that looks like and a few different methods to do that. In the survey kit, you will also have a thermometer to measure water temperature and air temperature. You'll have a pencil and pen, a clipboard, the spawning survey cover sheet, quadrat sheets, the resite survey data, and all of these sheets, I will go over what they look like and how to fill them out. So if you have any questions about that, we will be going over that. I would absolutely recommend bringing waders or hip boots. As it gets warmer, you can do some kind of sandal, but if you're going to be going out in the water, it can be easier to use the waders and hip boots, especially if it's a rocky area or if there are shells. It just adds a little bit of extra protection there. And then your phone or watch is super essential. We want to make sure that we're filling out the survey start time, the end time, and what time you arrive at the site so we can get a general idea of how long it's taking you to complete the survey and how close to the high tide window you are to starting the survey. If you are joining us on a night survey, we will not be providing flashlights or headlamps. So I would definitely recommend in bringing one or investing in one. I do have an extra one that I carry around. So if you're with me, I do all of the night surveys and hopefully I'll have that extra one when we do it together. This is what the spawning survey cover sheet looks like. So someone in your party is going to be responsible for recording all of the data throughout the entire survey. So they're going to be responsible for filling out this sheet, making sure that you record the people that are joining you on the survey, what time you arrive, the start and end time. And I've taken the liberty of filling out the survey start location as well as the random starting location. So the end of the beach that you're starting on, either north, south, east, or west, I've already filled that out, as well as the random starting number. So how many meters you're taking steps after you get to that end of the beach. So if you have any questions about that, let me know, but that'll be filled out on every single cover sheet going forward. The environmental conditions, if you don't have the app Fish Weather, I would absolutely recommend downloading that. That'll give you the wind speed, the wind direction, so you don't really have to worry about guessing. You shouldn't guess, where it's coming from. Make sure you're checking where it is and getting that data. The cloud coverage is pretty simple, just looking up at the sky. If it's overcast, partly cloudy, is it raining, is it foggy? So you want to make sure that we get all those environmental conditions on there. And then you can write any comments on the bottom of the sheet. You can write, saw a lot of horseshoe crabs, outside of it. If you want to calculate the total, you can. You don't have to. Some people do that. If you want to talk more about environmental conditions that may not be on the sheet already, you can do that. And please make sure you write down the end time. It is super, super important. This is the quadrat sheet. So again, if you joined us a few years prior, we were counting clusters. A cluster is basically a female with any number of male horseshoe crabs attached, so one female, 4 males. We're no longer calculating those. We're not writing them down anymore, just to make it simpler and easier to record. So you don't have to keep track of that. We're just going to be counting the number of females, the number of males, and the number of outside crabs. And you can write the gender for the outside crabs. It is great for our data. And then that total number of crabs is only for the number of females and males that are inside the quadrat. Filling out the quad number, you're just going to do 1, 2, 3, 4 until you get to the end. It can be really, really helpful to fill that out before you start the survey. That way you're not trying to write everything down as you're going through the quadrats. I found that it's super helpful and much easier to go through when you pre-write those. So this is an example. So if you're at quadrat 7, there's 2 females, 3 males, and no outside crabs. You'll just enter those numbers in there. And the outside crabs is what you can see from where you are standing in the water from the 5-meter quadrat pole. So you're not going to be walking out too much farther than the pole, but you're going to just write down what you can see from that spot. And this is where I talk
Haley,
about...
we lost your voice.
Can you hear me? Give me one.
Yes, I can hear you.
Nothing changed, so something went wrong on your end, I guess. We can still hear her.
Yeah, I can still hear everything fine.
Kathy, can you hear everyone else?
Guys, I've lost everybody. I'll
Kathy, can you?
because I can't hear anybody.
Good. Yes. Okay.
All right. Sorry about that. So this is the different quadrat methods that I was talking about a little bit earlier on that supplies sheet. So if you take a look down at the bottom left, in this picture here, these black lines represent the quadrat poles, and these lines connecting each pole is the 5-meter rope that will measure the 5 meters between each pole. So you can do this a number of ways, but if you're in an area where there's little to no crabs, you can use the fast method. So what this is instead of arranging the quadrat poles in a right angle, it'll be displayed in a straight line. So it'll be measuring 10 meters just along the shore of the beach. You're not going to be entering really the water as much with the 5-meter pole. Mark, do you have a question? Oh, I can't hear you.
I was waving goodbye to Emily. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry about that. This can be a quicker method. So if you know for sure that there's not, 5, 10 crabs in the area, there's 0 to maybe 2, 3 crabs that you can see from the quadrat pole, you can use the fast method. And this is most easy if you have 3 or more people. Otherwise, you'll be using the 3-sided quadrat method, and I would pretty much use this method at all other times. So this is the best way to keep track of your quadrats and the horseshoe crabs. The males tend to move pretty quickly. They'll follow you along the shoreline. So this really helps keep track of which crabs were in which quadrat. You definitely don't want to be recounting any crabs. So this will help with that. So this is that right angle that I was talking about. This is the image on the right side underneath the 3-sided quadrat section. So 2 of the poles will be extended 5 meters apart on the shoreline, and then the 3rd pole will be extended 5 meters into the water. So this will definitely help show how far the horseshoe crabs are, whether they're inside or outside. So if the crabs are a little bit farther, you're not sure if it hit that 5-meter line, or if it's inside or outside, definitely extend that 5-meter pole. This will really help determine that section of the quadrat sheet, whether it's inside or outside. This is an example. So we have somebody on the shore. They're keeping track of everything on the cover sheet, on the quadrat sheet. We have somebody that's a little farther than the shoreline, but at the shoreline, and then someone in the water 5 meters apart, making sure that they're keeping track of that distance. And this is where the hip boots can be really helpful if you're in the water, so that you're not getting too wet up to above the knees. Sandals or boots are better for if you're going to be on the shore, but again, it's whatever you're most comfortable with. So there are some best practices, and I talked about a few of them already, but making sure to keep track of the roaming crabs is really important. You don't want to double count any of these because this can skew the data. You don't want to add more than there are. And this is oftentimes going to be single males. So you don't typically see a single female roaming around. It usually has a male attached, but the males really like to follow along. They get really confused by rocks and boots, and to them it looks like a female. So they'll usually follow us. For the outside number of crabs, you want to make sure that if they're outside, that you put them in the number of outside crabs section. You don't want to count them as the inside crabs. That's where the 5-meter pole extended into the water can really help. If you're not sure, if you're using the fast method and you're not sure if they're inside or outside the quadrat, double check and use that extra pole. And fill out every quadrat on the quadrat sheet, even if there is no crabs in it. So if you're at quadrat number 2 and there's 0 crabs, just put a big 0 there so you can keep track of the total quadrats that you've surveyed, because that number of quadrats is really important for the data that we collect. So we don't want to leave anything blank. If you did, quadrats 1, 2, 3, and there was no crabs in 2, make sure you put a big 0 there, or some kind of indication that there was no crabs, but that the quadrat was used. Surveying one quadrat at a time when there's many crabs is definitely the best practice. That way you're not getting too confused. This is really helpful for busy survey sites like Marsh 2-3, Priscilla's Landing. Depending on how many volunteers you're with also can help with that. So make sure that you're keeping track of the quadrats, make sure that you're keeping track of how you're measuring that. Coming away from the protocols just a little bit, what to do if you find a horseshoe crab with a button tag. So in the picture on the right here, it is upside down, but this is a U.S. Fish and Wildlife button tag that we're using to tag the horseshoe crabs. In your survey kit, there is a horseshoe crab resite data sheet, and this is where you'll record all of the information about that tag and that crab. The first thing that I would recommend with that is to take a picture of the tag. That way you're not writing everything down while the crab is kind of moving around in your hands. Your hands are all wet. So I would take a picture of the crab, take a picture of the tag, make sure you record the gender, or take note of the gender, release it, and then fill out all of the information on that resite data sheet. That information is also really important for our findings. So we want to keep track of their migration patterns and their return rates of the crabs. This year we haven't seen any tagged horseshoe crabs yet so far at the sites that we've done. So it's really important to keep an eye out for something like that. It can be helpful, like when you're walking from one side to the other to get to your starting location, take a look in the water, see if you can spot any with tags on your way over to the starting location. But yeah, this is what it'll look like if you find a crab like that. This is what that resite data sheet looks like. So it's very similar to the cover sheet that I showed you earlier. So you'll still collect all of the environmental data, what time the high tide was, the people that you were with, and you want to record the other horseshoe crabs in the area. And then this sheet right over here to the right is where you'll record where you found it, the tag number that's on there, if it's a living or dead crab, and if you remove the tag, which you won't be doing. If you want to write any comments on there, it would be helpful just so we know if is the horseshoe crab damaged or things like that. And that is all the information that I have for protocols. Does anyone have any questions?
Anyone?
Kathy?
Anyone?
You're muted still. Yep.
Yeah,
There you
I
go.
just unmuted. I think I'm the sole person here at this point. I just wanted to, when we were moving to the next section, I had just texted with my friend who was with me when we did the survey last year, and I was wrong about where we saw what we thought were the poachers. Her recollection was that it was on a beach either in Truro or in Wellfleet, but not at the sanctuary, but it was definitely during the survey window because that's why we were out and about. So for whatever that's worth.
Interesting. Yeah, Truro doesn't really have many crabs. I can't imagine a harvester would go there. So the plot thickens. If you learn anything else, let us know. Bailey, you could stop sharing, I think. Thanks, Bailey. I have a few more things. So let me go back to sharing. All right. Just a little bit about mark recapture. Probably should have Bailey cover this. You know, we do some tagging. I'd like to have Bailey reach out to the volunteers about setting up some tagging days. We've done that in the past. And so we get these round tags, these button tags from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. They have a unique number on it. Use a small section of a drill bit just to put a small hole enough to get the tag in there. And we get something, some years we'll get a 9% recapture rate, and it's basically beach walkers finding these and then calling them in. Now there's a website. I think they've done away with the phone number, and I'm sad to say you can't get those cool pewter pins anymore. They must have cut that line item from the federal budget. It's so those are keepsakes now. You could probably sell one on eBay at some point for a lot of money. But basically, random people reporting these is a big source of information on where our tagged crabs end up, alive or dead. But then also, as we're doing surveys, as Bailey talked about, we want to be vigilant. We want to have an eye out, checking that back corner of the prosoma for tags, either right or left side. Looks like in this case, we're doing it on the left side. I think we've done both, so check both sides. Sometimes if it's buried, you can kind of feel down to that part of the shell to feel if there's a tags. Resites are really important. Here's what they look like. And so I talked about an important resite that we got in Pleasant Bay last year, and it was a crab that Monomoy had tagged either on Monomoy itself or on Morris Island. And so that was a new type of movement between embayments that was not possible just 5 or 6 years ago. Because of the shifting inlets. I'm not going to cover. Mike Long did his master's study on acoustic telemetry. It's the same thing that some of you long timers would remember Sarah O'Toole. Now, I'm sorry, Sarah Martinez, now Sarah Martinez O'Toole, who ran our surveys for a long time. She did acoustic telemetry in Chatham around Monomoy, and then Mike Long did it in Wellfleet Harbor. And the idea is you put sonic transmitters on the crabs, and then there's a network of receiver buoys strategically located where if the crab gets within a certain distance of the buoy, the tag pings and the data is stored on the buoy. And so we get information on how the different tagged crabs are moving around. There's what the tags look like. So this was an important question. You don't need the specifics, but this is where the receiver buoys were. And this was to get a sense of, are they moving in and out of creek systems? Are they leaving the bay, the Wellfleet Bay altogether at the end of spawning? And it varied by individual crabs. Some did, some didn't. You don't need to know that kind of, some of the interesting things were that those receiver buoys are universal to several different projects, including different shark projects, striped bass research, sturgeon. And so they got 2 Atlantic sturgeon, 10 white sharks during that period. And now they're getting even more now that there are receivers out there specific for the sharks, and also 37 striped bass. So that was interesting. But that was answering a basic question about how they move within and between embayments for us here in Wellfleet. We've attempted juvenile surveys at different times. Here are the juveniles. We talked about their kind of nursery habitats earlier in creeks and flats. And it proved a little bit difficult, but we set up some transects. And this is the sanctuary here. Here's the sanctuary building. And then here's the creek that comes into Silver Spring. And you can find them. You can go out there at certain times and you can find the crabs and you can do quadrats and quantify them to some extent, the little juveniles. But then at a certain point in the tide cycle, they'll all mysteriously disappear. And then you're just seeing the tracks, if anything. And so they proved difficult to survey, though we knew they were there. But we couldn't come up with a good repeatable method. And we worked with Derek Perry, the state horseshoe crab biologist, on that. He had a specific interest in trying to find a way to survey juveniles to get a sense of potential recruitment into the adult spawning population for management purposes. That's how they manage the lobster fishery, is they survey juveniles and then they project forward. And the lobster fishery is considered pretty well managed as far as fisheries goes. But anyway, so we talked about this a little bit, but these are the 3 different embayments, each with their own management regime. So here in Cape Cod Bay and Wellfleet Bay, bait harvest is allowed. There probably isn't any targeted biomedical fishery, but these bait crabs are probably getting bled. But this is a bait fishery. And then Nauset is federal. It's part of the National Seashore. So as far as we know, there's no bait fishery there. We know people who live there who haven't seen bait fishing. And then Pleasant Bay, we have Erica's Beach and Marsh 2-3. There are tons of crabs down here, no bait harvest allowed. And that prohibition on bait harvest was put in place to protect the biomedical fishery back in, I want to say 2003. And so you've got a big barrier beach system with a lot of marsh, a lot of flats. So there's some good juvenile habitat here and there, some good spawning habitat, and then protect them from bait harvest. And these populations, like there are so many more spawning crabs here than here and anywhere in Cape Cod Bay. And we, the logical conclusion is that if you protect them from bait harvest, there will be more crabs, and that certainly seems to be the case. And they seem to be increasing. I mean, even this year there seemed to be more than last year, and last year there were more than the year before. So something is going on, and we're seeing that here in Nauset too. Some hints that things may be starting to increase on the Cape Cod Bay side, but we'll have to look at this year's data. Oh, I meant to fix this. Yeah, so for some reason this one doesn't include 2021. That's too bad. But you get the sense of the trends over time, and most importantly, the differences between the different embayments is what to look at here. Pleasant Bay, red. Nauset, some years is very high. And again, those are 2 embayments with no bait harvest allowed. And then down here, you've got Cape Cod Bay, you've got Wellfleet harbor sites, just sort of barely visible down here in blue. And that's consistent from year to year. And it was the same in 2021. Pleasant Bay, mainly Marsh 2-3, was way up, kind of on par with these other years. And this one only goes to 2020. But you get the idea. This was total crab density. So this is males and females. And then this is the more important metric. This is the spawning index, which is number of females per 25 square meters. This is all crabs per 25 square meters on the left, on the y-axis. And then this is females, spawning females per quadrat per 25 square meters. It's very low. I mean, we're talking like most of the sites are below 0.1 female per 25 square meters. Extremely, extremely low compared to Delaware Bay, where the densities, the spawning indices will be like 100 to 1,000 times higher than we see. And yet we allow more harvest. So let's say that again, because it's something that's hard to explain to normal people. Down in Delaware Bay, they have spawning densities and spawning indices on the beaches that are between 100 and 1,000 times higher than what we see here on Cape Cod Bay, but we allow more harvest than they do. We allow harvest of spawning females. They don't. We allow.
Why? Like, what special interest groups are allowed?
Well, it's the conch
to
fishery,
fish?
and it's the biomedical industry and the conch fishery. They depend on these crabs, and so that's why there's a bait fishery. And in terms of how they regulate it, we are asking that question of the state. That we're going to be meeting with them. We being the Horseshoe Crab Conservation Association, that a couple of us, Bob Prescott is on the board and I'm on the board. We wrote a letter to DMF asking for a meeting, and so we're going to be talking about these kinds of things. Other states have been tightening up regulations. Connecticut went from 400 allowed bait crabs allowed per day to 150. New York did the same thing. Connecticut is considering banning bait harvest altogether. There's a bill in the House right now that we're following. And so other states are tightening things up or have already done so years ago, where they don't allow female harvest, they don't allow harvest during much of the spawning season, that kind of thing. And so we're just kind of looking at Mass Division of Marine Fisheries. It's time to look at what other states are doing, and we don't want to be that state that has the most lax regulations. Is that why Charles River Labs came here? What do we need to do here in Massachusetts? Let's look at these regulations. Let's look at how low our densities are compared to other states, and be realistic about what our regulation should be. This is last year data. If you did surveys last year, you might remember May 13th was the peak for all the sites. And this is typical that you see this peak around now, and then it's just going to go down. And so by the end of June, you're definitely going to be seeing a lot less crabs than we've seen in the last week. So enjoy it while it lasts. It's some combination of them getting harvested and the females being done and leaving the area. It's hard to know which of those is the more important driver of this decline over the course of June, but it's clearly both. And this was true. Well, you can barely see the numbers at the sanctuary compared to Nauset Bay, no bait harvest, Marsh 2-3, no bait harvest, Erica's Beach, no bait harvest, and then the sanctuary beach is like. And then in terms of the current protections that they do have here in Massachusetts, which is no bait harvest allowed during the 5-day window, the same 5-day windows that we're doing our surveys. So 2 days before, the day of, and 2 days after the full moon, the same for the new moon. That 5-day window, there's no bait harvest allowed from mid-April through the end of June. So if you're doing horseshoe crab surveys, if there are horseshoe crab surveys scheduled, nobody should be harvesting for bait. But we know from just observation, and then also from this research done by Helen Cheng, who was the horseshoe crab coordinator here back in 2014 or 2013, maybe. She was just finishing her master's, and she did surveys throughout the 2 months, not just around the 5-day lunar windows, and there's lots of spawning between the windows. So the crabs are not, look at this, the crabs are not really super interested in the moons here in the Northeast. It's more about good weather, calm conditions, the water being above a certain temperature, and then they're in and spawning. And I have seen the most crabs I've ever seen spawning at the sanctuary at South Sunken Meadow Beach was on the absolute lowest tide of the month, directly between the two moons. I saw like 400 crabs out there one day. And that's when they're available to spawners, to harvesters, I'm sorry, is between the windows that we're doing the surveys. So we don't think those lunar closure protections do very much. So these kinds of rock walls, we talked about some of the habitat destruction that their spawning beaches have been subject to, these kinds of different things that result in there not being a beach anymore at high tide. As the high tide beach gets scoured away, They're forced to do a lot of intertidal spawning, it seems, here in Massachusetts. They like to spawn on sandbars and things well below the high tide line. Some research has shown that more frequently flooded nests don't hatch at the same rate. And so that's a concern. That's an area of research we might want to look into. So it takes them a long time to reach maturity. So any species that takes 10 years to reach breeding age is going to be difficult to recover. It's because you make some management change and then, well, let's wait 12 years and see what happens. And so that's a difficult aspect of this. We talked about all of these different things. You have to consider harvest levels in this context of habitat loss and ask yourself, should we be harvesting this much given the other stresses on horseshoe crab populations? The state has been looking at the size. They measure the prosomal width of male and females at the bait dealers. And I know even Derek Perry, the state horseshoe crab biologist whose slide this is concerned about the decrease in female size that's been happening. But that's something that has always happened in every overexploited fishery. So it should not be news to anybody who studies fisheries for and does that for their job. But the female size is declining for some reason. The different fisheries tend to like big females. The biomedical fishery likes big females, and the bait fishermen like them as well. That's been studied. The bleeding effects has been studied, so you might wonder, okay, you take 33% of the blood of a horseshoe crab at the biomedical facility, do your best to keep them moist and cool and all that kind of stuff. There are best management practices they're supposed to follow. Only have them out of the water for 36 hours, but still that's a long time. Then they might be in holding pens in Pleasant Bay, so they're not able to spawn because they're sitting in a holding pen, just dropping eggs into the water column. But also, if they do release them back into the bay, they have low blood proteins, they have orientation and mobility issues, and this has been studied in various studies, is the takeaway from this slide. I talked about alternative baits. There was a grad student studying this. People were looking at green crabs. Nothing. It was just kind of fell with a dud. I mean, nothing has come out of this. I saw a comment from somebody in Connecticut talking about eliminating the bait harvest in Long Island Sound there in Connecticut, and they were saying that my son is a whelk fisherman and green crabs work fine, or other things work fine. So I don't know. That's not what we've heard in Massachusetts. It's they have to use horseshoe crabs for bait. Nothing else works as well. LAL substitutes. So is there a synthetic substitute? Can science save us from this part of horseshoe crab harvest by coming up with a synthetic alternative? And there have been various synthetic alternatives developed. Some of them haven't worked very well. A typical problem with the synthetic alternatives to LAL is that they only are able to detect endotoxin reliably in pure water. When you add any kind of solutes, and as you do when you're developing vaccines and things like that, it tends to make the results unreliable, and that's true of RFC. So RFC, recombinant factor C, is the best known big deal synthetic alternative that everybody in horseshoe crab conservation is like, well, we have this, why don't they just improve it? It's just as good. I've heard that it's not just as good. It only works very well in pure water and that kind of thing. It would require expensive upgrades to the machinery that is used to read the test compared to LAL. And so while it's been approved in Europe, it's not used very much. It is true that European Pharmacopoeia did approve RFC. It's not been approved here in the US by FDA. But even if it did get approved, it's not clear it would be used very much because it's not as reliable and it requires more expensive machines than LAL does. So that's my understanding of that situation. You'll often hear it's been approved in Europe, but my understanding is that the companies aren't really using it. Eli Lilly is the big pharma company that where there's a birder in a prominent position at Eli Lilly who is really pushing for RFC. They use it to the extent that they are allowed to use it. They have to use it in conjunction with LAL, and they have used it for certain of their drugs, certain of their products, and they have been working with conservation organizations based in New Jersey and elsewhere, promoting the adoption of RFC. My understanding is that's not super likely, certainly not anytime soon. And I talked about the misinformation about how much LAL is used in vaccine production. And the answer is not very much. So our local company, ACC, Associates of Cape Cod, that's the local company that makes LAL, that bleeds horseshoe crabs and makes LAL. They created an alternative that is better. It seems to be objectively better. It includes all components of the cascade, not just one. RFC is just one part of a 3-step cascade that constitutes the horseshoe crab's immune system. This is all three. It has all 3 parts. It wouldn't require changing anybody's machinery, but it's much more recent. And so it's got there's a lot of work to do to getting it tested and approved. And it's also, I think, fairly expensive right now, is my understanding. So, I mean, it seems very promising, but it's not going to be approved tomorrow. And it's not very well known currently. RFC really takes up all the oxygen because of the big organizations that are really promoting it, including New Jersey Audubon and their associates and Eli Lilly. So what will save horseshoe crabs? If the whelk fishery completely collapses as a going concern, then no one would need to be harvesting them as bait. That's not something we can count on, although that's not a very well-managed fishery either. We would like to see some combination of the protections they have in place in other states. Other states, mind you, where they have way, way, way more crabs than we do, but they have protections like not allowing females to be harvested, not allowing any crabs to be harvested during May and part of June, having closed areas. I mean, we do have closed areas because of federal ownership here in Massachusetts, but other states have created some harvest sanctuaries. We could have more of those here. We could close Cape Cod Bay because the populations are so low and just see what happens. And that wouldn't affect the overall harvest that much, but it would help us out. And then I said, would there be a bait substitute for whelk? If somebody can finally come up with that, that would be a huge deal, and you wouldn't need to harvest them for bait anymore. I talked about whelk fishery decline, and then both FDA and industry acceptance of an LAL, a synthetic alternative to LAL, so you wouldn't need to bleed the horseshoe crabs anymore. These are things that we would all be able to just go home and consider the horseshoe crabs saved, except for all the habitat loss. But this would be a big deal if any of those things happened. All right, I've held forth for too long. Stop sharing.
I do have one comment before we wrap up that I should have mentioned a little bit earlier. We did already have a situation like this season. If there is inclement weather, if there's thunderstorms or lightning in the area, we will be canceling the survey. Light rain, we can still do it, but if the thunderstorms are rolling in, then we will cancel the survey.
Nor'easters, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Big storms, we will be canceling.
Yeah, I mean, if it's really windy, there are times when it's not going to be worth your time, because if it's windy and rainy, especially if it's dark on top of all of that, you're not going to be able to see the crabs, and they probably won't be spawning very much. But yeah, I think Bailey covered it.
Bailey, how will you communicate with us? Like I was scheduled to go out during the nor'easter last year. So, and they made the call at 6:30 that we were going, and then they didn't make the call that we aren't going until we were literally in the car. So I'm just wondering how you think you'll approach the go, no go, and how you'll communicate with us.
Sure. So what I actually did, so I think it was Saturday, there was a storm, and we had to cancel the night survey. When I got out of work at 5 o'clock, I will check the weather up until the survey. If it says that there's going to be rain, I'll email you saying, there's rain in the area. I'll keep you updated on what we're going to be doing. And then I'll email you if it's canceled, and hopefully I'll get to you an hour or two before the survey. I don't want anybody making their way out there and then I cancel it and then you have to go right home. I'll try to give you as much time as I can. It does help if you give me your cell phone number, because some people, I've been finding that my emails have been going to their spam. So that could happen if you're not seeing emails from me.
We need to do calls for especially a last minute cancellation. We need to make sure we have everybody's cell phone number. So we'll double check that. And
and if you're missing anything, just, you were going to put out a sort of a schedule anyway at some point.
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, well, I apologize that you all were on for, I guess, two of us, but this is really informative. Thank you.
We recorded this and then it'll go out to everybody. So it was good to have an audience. Thank you for being here. I don't know what happened. Like several people signed up for the doodle that weren't here for some reason. But anyway, this allowed us to record it, and then people who weren't here can watch it. So this has been great. Thanks, Kathy.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
All right. Have a great day.
All right, Mark, I'll end the meeting.